A janitor reading contracts now. Daniel Carter's voice cut clean across the glass boardroom. Light, amused, the kind of laugh that didn't need permission. A few suits joined in, quiet at first, then bolder when they saw his smile hold. At the far end of the table, Maya Williams stood still beside a stainless steel cart, fingers wrapped loosely around a folded cloth, the faint scent of lemon cleaner lingering in the air. The skyline behind them stretched in cold blue lines, sunlight bouncing off mirrored towers. But inside the room, everything narrowed to the pin in Daniel's hand hovering just above the signature line. He didn't look at her. Not really. Just a glance, quick, dismissive, like checking a reflection that didn't matter. Sir, Maya said again, softer this time, but steady. Please check page 17. The room shifted, almost imperceptibly, not because of her words, but because she hadn't moved. Most people in her position would have stepped back by now, apologized, disappeared into the quiet corners where people like her were expected to exist. But she didn't. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking under the weight of his confidence. His cufflinks caught the light, small flashes of silver that matched the edge in his tone. We have lawyers for that, he said, tapping the document once with his pen. And a timeline. We're not stopping a multi-million-dollar deal because someone pushing a mop got curious. A pause. Controlled. Intentional. He was used to silence obeying him. Maya's eyes didn't drop. They moved, briefly, to the contract, then back to him, calm in a way that didn't challenge, but didn't retreat either. It's not curiosity, she said. It's a risk. That word landed differently. Not loud, not dramatic, but it didn't dissolve like the others. Across the table, a junior associate shifted in his seat, glancing down at the stack of papers as if seeing them for the first time. Daniel noticed the movement, just enough to tighten his jaw before smoothing it again into that same easy smile. There's always risk, he replied, voice even, almost patient now. That's why we win. Because we know how to handle it. He lowered the pen slightly, closer to the page. The black ink tip hovered a fraction of an inch above the line that would lock everything in. The air felt thinner. Maya took a small step forward, not enough to interrupt, just enough to be seen. This clause doesn't protect you, she said, her voice quiet but precise, each word placed like it mattered. It transfers the liability. All of it. For the first time, Daniel's pen stopped moving entirely. Not lowered, not lifted, just paused. A beat passed, then another. Somewhere behind him, a chair shifted again, sharper this time. The junior associate leaned forward, fingers already flipping to page 17, eyes scanning faster than breath. The room didn't laugh now. It listened. Daniel didn't look at Maya yet. Not fully, but the smile, just at the edge of his mouth, faltered, barely there, like something small had slipped through the cracks of his certainty. And for the first time since she spoke, the silence didn't belong to him anymore. The soft rustle of paper cut through the stillness as the junior associate's fingers moved faster, flipping back and forth between clauses, his brow tightening with every line he reread. Hold on, he said, not loudly, but enough to shift the weight of the room again. Daniel's grip on the pen adjusted, subtle, controlled, but no longer relaxed. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he watched the associate trace a paragraph with his finger, lips parting as if to speak, then stopping, recalculating. Section 14, subsection C. The associate murmured, almost to himself, then louder, this does not cap liability. It redirects it. Completely. A low murmur spread across the table, no longer laughter, but something sharper, uncertain. One of the senior executives reached for his own copy, flipping pages with less confidence than before, his cuff brushing the polished wood, the faint click echoing in the quiet. Daniel finally looked up, not at the associate, but past him, toward Maya. The distance between them felt different now. Smaller, somehow. But he did not speak to her yet. Instead, he extended his hand toward the document. Give me that, he said, calm, measured, but the ease was gone. The associate slid the contract across the table. The sound of paper against wood seemed louder than it should have been. Daniel's eyes moved quickly, scanning, then slowing, then stopping. The line was there, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in legal language that softened the edges but sharpened the consequence. His jaw tightened, just enough to change the shape of his face. For a moment, no one moved. The skyline outside remained bright, indifferent, cars far below moving in steady lines that had nothing to do with what was happening inside that room. "It is standard phrasing," one executive said carefully, though his voice lacked conviction. "It is not," the associate replied, more firmly now. "It removes shared responsibility. If anything fails post-merger, we absorb everything." Silence followed. Not the kind Daniel controlled, but the kind that built on its own, heavy and undeniable. His thumb pressed lightly against the edge of the page, as if grounding himself in something solid. Then, slowly, he set the pen down. The small click as it touched the table echoed more than it should have. Across the room, Maya exhaled quietly, almost unnoticeable, her hands still steady at her sides. She did not step forward again. She did not speak. She had already said what mattered. Daniel leaned back, but this time the movement was different. Not relaxed, not dominant, but deliberate, like he was recalibrating something internal. His gaze lifted once more, meeting hers directly now. There was no smile left. Just a question he had not expected to ask. "How did you see that?" he said, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier edge. Maya held his gaze for a brief second, then glanced down at the document in his hands. "Because it is written to be missed," she said simply. Another pause, longer this time. Daniel's eyes returned to the page, then to the room, then back to her again, as if aligning pieces that no longer fit the version of reality he had walked in with. Around him, the executives sat straighter, quieter, waiting for direction that had not yet come. For the first time, Daniel did not have it ready. And in that space, that thin, shifting silence, one thing became clear without anyone needing to say it. The deal was no longer the only thing at risk. Daniel's fingers remained on the edge of the contract, but he was no longer reading the words. He was replaying the last 60 seconds, every tone, every glance, every assumption he had made without question. Around him, the room shifted into a quieter rhythm, the kind that came when people realized something important had almost gone very wrong. One executive cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as if that small motion could restore control. "We should pause the signing," he said carefully. No one argued, not even Daniel. That alone changed the air. He closed the folder halfway, not fully, as if he was not ready to let it go yet, but no longer willing to move forward blindly. Across the table, the junior associate sat back, still holding his pen, but no longer writing, his eyes flicking once more toward Maya, before quickly looking away, unsure where to place her now in the hierarchy that had just cracked open. Daniel stood slowly. The chair behind him slid back with a soft, controlled sound. Normally, that movement would signal conclusion, authority, a clear direction forward. But this time, it felt like something else. Like recalculation. He walked around the table, not rushing, not hesitating, each step measured against the polished floor. The distance between him and Maya closed in seconds, but the weight of it stretched longer. She did not move. She did not straighten or shrink. She simply waited, hands still, posture quiet, as if she had already stepped outside whatever this moment was becoming. Daniel stopped a few feet in front of her. Up close, the contrast was sharper. His tailored suit, precise, deliberate. Her uniform, simple, clean, almost invisible by design. And yet, in that moment, she was the only one in the room he could not ignore. "You said it transfers all liability," he said, his voice lower now, not for the room, but for her. "You are certain?" It was not a challenge. It was a question he needed answered without the filter of ego. Maya nodded once. "Yes, sir." A brief pause. Then she added, "If anything goes wrong after the merger, your company carries it alone. Lawsuits, penalties, everything." The words settled between them, heavier now that he had confirmed them himself. Behind him, someone shifted again, the faint scrape of a chair reminding him that he was still being watched, still expected to lead. But leadership, in that moment, did not look like control. It looked like listening. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders releasing just enough to show that something inside him had shifted. He glanced back at the table, at the executives who had trusted him to sign, at the document that had nearly sealed a mistake no one else had caught in time. Then he looked at Maya again. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked. It was not suspicion. It was recognition trying to form. Maya hesitated for the first time, not out of fear, but out of habit, like she was used to questions leading nowhere good. I studied finance, she said quietly. A few years. Another pause. The room absorbed that, recalibrating again, adjusting the story it had already written about her. Daniel's gaze held for a moment longer, then shifted, thoughtful now, no trace of the earlier dismissal left. He nodded once, more to himself than to her. Then he turned back toward the table. We are not signing this today, he said, clear, steady. Legal team, I want a full review. Every line. No one argued. No one laughed. The authority was still there, but it felt different now. Earned again, not assumed. Behind him, Maya stepped back quietly, returning to the edge of the room where she had started, as if nothing about her position had changed. But something had. Not in her. In the way the room now saw her. And as Daniel picked up the contract again, this time with care instead of certainty, one thought settled in, sharp and undeniable. The most important voice in the room had almost been the one he refused to hear. The room did not return to normal. It shifted into something quieter, more careful, like every word now carried weight it had not before. Papers moved, but slower. Voices lowered, measured. The legal team leaned closer together, flipping through pages with a different kind of urgency, no longer confident, now searching. Daniel remained standing at the head of the table, the contract open again in his hands. But this time he read it line by line, not as a formality, but as if each sentence might hide another mistake waiting to surface. The sunlight through the glass walls had shifted slightly, casting longer reflections across the polished floor, stretching shadows in ways that made the room feel less certain, less controlled. Across the room, Maya had already returned to her cart. The metal wheels made a soft sound as she adjusted it, the cloth in her hand folding neatly, methodically, as if nothing significant had just happened. She moved toward the far side of the room, wiping down the edge of a glass panel, her reflection faint and distorted in the surface. No one stopped her. No one spoke to her. But eyes followed her now. Not openly, not long, but enough to acknowledge what had changed. Daniel noticed. Not because he was watching her directly, but because he could feel the shift in attention, the way the room no longer treated her as background. He closed the contract slowly, pressing it flat against the table with his palm. Who drafted this? He asked, his voice cutting through the low murmur. A senior executive hesitated before answering, adjusting his glasses as if buying time. Vaughn Legal Group handled the initial draft, he said. It was reviewed internally before this meeting. Daniel nodded once, his expression unreadable, but the silence that followed carried something sharper than before. Reviewed. He repeated quietly, as if testing the word against reality. No one responded. The implication hung there, clear enough without being spoken. Across the table, the junior associate spoke again, more cautiously this time. It is designed to look balanced, he said. But the wording creates a one-sided exposure. It is subtle, easy to miss if you trust the structure. Daniel's gaze flicked to him, then back to the document, then briefly, almost unconsciously, toward Maya. She had not looked up. She continued her work, slow, precise, consistent. Not trying to draw attention, not trying to hold it either. Just present. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a controlled release, then straightened slightly. Then we stop trusting the structure, he said. We verify everything. The command was simple, but the tone carried a shift that the room understood immediately. This was no longer routine. This was recovery. The executives nodded, some more quickly than others, as laptops opened and notes were taken with renewed focus. The momentum of the deal had paused, but something else had started. A deeper scrutiny, a necessary doubt. Daniel stepped back from the table, creating space, but his mind remained fixed on the moment that had changed everything. The way she had spoken, the certainty without arrogance, the calm that did not seek approval. It did not fit the role he had assigned to her, and that realization unsettled him more than the clause itself. He turned once more, this time fully, his eyes settling on Maya as she finished wiping the glass panel and folded the cloth again with quiet precision. For a brief second, their eyes met across the room. No words passed. Between them, none were needed. But something unspoken lingered in that glance. Not gratitude. Not yet. Something closer to recognition. And as Daniel looked away, returning his attention to the contract and the team now working under a different kind of pressure, one truth settled deeper than before. The mistake had not been in the document alone. It had been in the assumption that the most important insight could not come from someone like her. The steady rhythm of quiet work continued, but it no longer felt routine. Every page turned sounded sharper. Every whispered exchange carried a trace of caution. Daniel stood near the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against the polished surface, the contract still open but no longer commanding the same authority it had minutes before. His eyes moved across the room, not scanning for control, but observing something he had missed earlier. The people, the reactions, the subtle shifts that did not fit his expectations. At the far end, Maya adjusted the position of her cardigan, aligning it neatly against the wall before reaching for another cloth. Her movements were efficient, practiced, almost invisible by design, but now nothing about her presence felt invisible anymore. One of the executives leaned closer to another, voice low but not low enough. How did she even catch that? The question was not meant for her, but it lingered in the air anyway. Daniel heard it. He did not respond, but the answer formed in his mind without effort. She was paying attention. Something the rest of them had assumed was already handled. He pushed himself off the table slightly, straightening his posture as if resetting his place in the room. "I want a second external review," he said, his tone steady but firmer now. "Not affiliated with Fawn. Independent." Heads nodded immediately. No hesitation this time. The authority in his voice had returned, but it carried a different weight. Less assumption, more intention. The junior associate glanced up briefly, then back down, already making notes, the pen moving faster than before. Daniel walked slowly along the length of the table, stopping beside the window where the city stretched endlessly below. Cars moved in thin lines, distant and unaffected, while inside, everything had shifted direction. He placed a hand against the glass for a moment, feeling the cool surface ground him. Then he turned back. His gaze moved across the room once more, then settled again, almost instinctively, on Maya. She had just finished wiping the edge of a conference chair, smoothing the surface with careful precision. She paused for a brief second, sensing the attention, then resumed, not acknowledging it directly. Daniel watched that for a moment longer than necessary. Not because he needed confirmation of what she had done, but because he was trying to understand something else. The difference between knowing and noticing. Between having access to information and actually seeing it. He stepped away from the window and walked back toward the table, but this time his path shifted slightly. Instead of stopping at his chair, he continued past it, closing the distance again. Not abrupt, not commanding, just deliberate. When he reached her, he did not speak immediately. He waited until she finished folding the cloth in her hands. Only then did he say, quietly, "Maya." It was the first time he used her name. She looked up, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "Yes, sir." Her voice was the same, calm, unchanged, as if nothing about the room had altered her. Daniel nodded once, a small gesture, but intentional. "You were right to speak up," he said. No performance, no audience in the tone, just acknowledgement. Around them, the room continued working, but the moment held its own space, quiet and contained. Maya gave a slight nod in return. "I did not want you to sign something like that," she said simply. "Not, I told you. Not, I warned you. Just the reason. Clean. Direct." Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of that simplicity settling deeper than any explanation could. He glanced briefly back at the contract on the table, then returned his gaze to her. For a moment, it looked like he might say something more. Ask another question. Offer something beyond acknowledgement. But he did not. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back, giving her space again, but not distance in the same way as before. And as he returned to the table, picking up the contract with a care that had replaced his earlier certainty, one realization stayed with him, steady and unavoidable. The difference between losing everything and saving it had come down to a voice he almost ignored. The meeting did not end, but it changed direction entirely. The urgency that once pushed it forward now pulled it inward, deeper, more deliberate. Laptops glowed brighter as screens filled with annotations, red marks cutting across what had once been considered final. Voices stayed low, but there was no longer any casual tone left in them. Every word was weighed, every assumption questioned. Daniel remained at the table, but he no longer stood above it. He was part of it now, leaning slightly forward, One hand braced against the surface as he listened instead of directing. If this clause is intentional, one of the legal advisors said, adjusting her glasses as she reread the section again, then it is not just a mistake. It is strategy. That word settled differently. Strategy. Not oversight. Not accident. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the implication forming before anyone needed to say it out loud. Someone across the table exhaled quietly, the kind of breath that carried both realization and discomfort. They expected us not to notice, the junior associate added, his voice steadier now, more confident in the space that had opened for him. Daniel nodded once, slow, controlled, but his mind had already moved ahead. He flipped the page again, scanning not just for errors, but for patterns, for intent. The contract was no longer just a document. It was a message, and he had almost signed it without reading between the lines. Behind him, Maya continued her work, now near the far wall where the light from the windows softened against the glass. The faint streaks she wiped away disappeared with each careful motion, leaving behind a surface so clear it almost looked like nothing was there at all. Invisible effort. Visible result. Daniel's eyes drifted toward her again, not out of habit this time, but out of something closer to recognition. She had seen what they had missed, not because she had access, but because she had not assumed anything was safe. That difference stayed with him. He straightened slightly, turning back to the table. Contact Vaughn, he said, his tone calm, but sharpened by clarity. Tell them the review raised concerns. We are delaying the signing. A few heads lifted at that, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of what that meant. Delay was not just a pause. It was leverage. It was signal. The senior executive who had spoken earlier nodded quickly, already reaching for his phone. Understood, he said. We will handle communication. Daniel did not respond immediately. He watched as the message was typed, as the language was carefully chosen, neutral on the surface, but firm underneath. Then he turned slightly, his gaze shifting once more toward Maya. She had paused for a moment, adjusting the position of a chair that had been moved slightly out of alignment. A small detail, easy to ignore, but she fixed it anyway. Daniel noticed that. Of course she would. She noticed everything. He took a step away from the table, then another, until he stood just a few feet from her again. This time, the room did not stop. No one turned to look. But the awareness was there, subtle, present. You saw it immediately, he said, his voice low, not drawing attention. Before anyone else. Maya finished aligning the chair, her hands resting briefly on the backrest before she looked up. It stood out, she said simply, because it did not match the rest. Daniel absorbed that, the simplicity of it cutting deeper than any technical explanation. Not matching. A detail out of place. Something most people overlooked when they trusted the bigger picture too easily. He nodded slowly. Most people trusted the structure, he said. Maya gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That is why it works, she replied. A brief silence passed between them, but it was not empty. It carried understanding, quiet and precise. Daniel glanced back at the table, at the contract now marked with corrections, at the team working with a different kind of focus than before. Then he looked at her again, not as someone outside the room, but as someone who had changed it. You did not have to speak up, he said. It was not a test. It was acknowledgement of risk. Maya held his gaze for a moment, then answered in the same steady tone she had used from the beginning. Yes, I did. No hesitation. No explanation beyond that. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, something thoughtful replacing what had once been certainty. He understood now. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to recognize the difference between obligation and character. He stepped back again, giving her space, but this time the distance did not feel like separation. It felt like respect. And as he returned to the table, lifting the contract once more with careful attention, one realization stayed steady in his mind. The real risk had not been hidden in the document alone. It had been in the assumption that someone like her would stay silent. The tension in the room no longer came from urgency, but from awareness. Every person at the table now moved with a kind of restraint, as if they understood that confidence without verification had nearly cost them everything. Daniel stood at the center again, but his posture had changed. He was no longer projecting certainty. He was measuring it. Run a comparison against previous agreements, he said, his voice steady but quieter than before. I want to know if this pattern has shown up anywhere else. The legal team nodded immediately, fingers moving across keyboards, pulling up archived documents, scanning for anything that echoed the structure in front of them. The soft tapping of keys filled the room, replacing what had once been casual conversation. Outside, the light shifted further, the sun lowering just enough to cast longer reflections across the glass walls, stretching the room into something more reflective, less rigid. Daniel watched the team work, but his attention did not stay there for long. It drifted again, drawn back to the same point it had returned to several times already. Maya had moved to the far side of the room, near the corner where the glass met the wall, cleaning the last section with slow, deliberate strokes. She worked as if the room had returned to normal, as if her role had not changed, as if the moment that altered everything had already passed for her. But for Daniel, it had not. He stepped away from the table again, this time without announcing anything, without drawing attention. His movement was quiet, almost unnoticed, until he was standing a few feet from her once more. "You said it stood out," he began, his tone low, controlled, "because it did not match." Maya finished wiping the surface before responding, folding the cloth carefully in her hands. "Yes, sir." Daniel nodded slightly, his gaze shifting briefly to the glass she had just cleaned. It was clear now, almost invisible, reflecting only faint outlines of the room behind them. "What else does not match?" he asked. It was not a casual question. It carried weight, expectation, and something new beneath it. Trust, still forming, but present. Maya paused for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood what he was asking. Her eyes moved briefly toward the table, where the contract lay open, surrounded by notes and highlighted lines. Then she looked back at him. "The timeline," she said. "It is too favorable on their side." Daniel's brow tightened slightly. "Explain." Maya took a small breath, steady, measured. "The milestones are structured to give them exit points early," she said. "If performance drops, they can step away without penalty. But if your side fails to meet any condition, even minor, the penalties increase immediately." The words settled into place with precision, each one adding another layer to what they had already uncovered. Daniel turned his head slightly, glancing back at the table, where one of the analysts had just pulled up the timeline section on a screen. Even from a distance, he could see the pattern forming. Imbalance. Designed, not accidental. He looked back at Maya, the realization deepening. "You saw that too," he said quietly. Maya gave a small nod. "It follows the same logic," she replied. "It looks fair, but it is not." A brief silence passed between them, but it was not uncertain. It was confirming. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling into something sharper, more defined. This was no longer a single issue. It was a structure built to fail them if they did not catch it in time. He straightened slightly, then turned back toward the table, his voice carrying just enough to reach the team. "Review the timeline conditions," he said. "Cross-check every milestone. I want to see where the imbalance starts." The response was immediate. Screens shifted, notes updated. The room adjusted again, aligning with the new direction. Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, his back partially turned to the table, his attention still anchored to Maya. She had already returned to her work, placing the folded cloth back on the card, adjusting its position with quiet precision. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She did not seek it. She simply moved forward. Daniel watched that for a brief second, then nodded once, more to himself than to her. As he turned back toward the table, picking up the contract again, his grip firm but measured, one thought remained clear, sharper than before. The deal had not nearly failed because of complexity. It had nearly failed because they had trusted what looked right instead of questioning what did not. The room moved faster now, but with intention instead of momentum. Screens refreshed, sections highlighted, comparisons layered side by side as patterns began to emerge more clearly. What once looked like a standard agreement now revealed itself piece by piece, each clause aligning with the next like a design that had been too carefully constructed to be accidental. "It is consistent," the analyst said, pointing at the screen, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. "The liability clause, the timeline, the exit conditions, they all lean one direction." Daniel stood beside the table, his attention fixed on the display, but his mind was already ahead of it. He did not react immediately. He let the information settle, Let the room absorb what was now undeniable. Then he spoke, calm but firm. They expected us to trust the surface, he said, and move fast. No one disagreed. No one needed to. The truth of it was already visible in the way the team now worked, slower, sharper, more aware of what had almost happened. Across the room, Maya guided her cart toward the door, her work nearly complete. The faint sound of the wheels against the floor was soft, almost lost beneath the quiet intensity of the meeting, but Daniel noticed it. Of course he did. He turned slightly, his eyes following her movement for a brief moment before returning to the table. If we had signed this, one executive said, his voice lower now, we would have been locked in within 90 days. Another added, and exposed immediately after the first performance review. The implications stacked quickly, each one heavier than the last. Daniel picked up the contract again, flipping back to the first page, then forward, then back again, not searching for something new, but confirming what he already understood. This was not a mistake. It was an advantage, carefully hidden in plain sight. He set the document down once more, this time with finality. Prepare a revised position, he said. We are not just rejecting this. We are responding to it. Heads lifted slightly at that. The shift in language mattered. Rejecting meant stepping away. Responding meant taking control. The senior executive nodded, already adjusting his notes. We can restructure the liability distribution and tighten the exit terms, he said. Daniel nodded once. And we make it clear we saw everything, he added. A brief pause followed, not from uncertainty, but from the recognition of what that statement carried. Across the room, Maya reached the door and paused for a second, adjusting the handle of her cart. She did not look back. She did not wait. She had done what she needed to do. Daniel watched that moment, the quiet finality of it, and something in his expression shifted again. Not just acknowledgement, something closer to understanding. He turned back to the table, but his focus did not fully leave her. Before we send anything, he said, his voice steady, I want every section reviewed one more time. No assumptions. The team responded immediately, the rhythm of work continuing, but more refined now, more deliberate. The contract was no longer a threat. It was a lesson, and they were not missing anything again. Daniel stepped back slightly, giving the team space, his eyes moving once more toward the door, just as it opened quietly. Maya guided the cart through without a sound, the door closing gently behind her. The room remained still for a fraction of a second after she left, as if something had shifted with her absence. Then the work resumed. But for Daniel, the moment did not move on as easily. He stood there, looking at the closed door, the reflection of the city faintly visible in the glass, and one thought settled deeper than the rest. The deal could be rewritten. The strategy could be corrected. But the difference between failure and control had come from someone who would walk out of that room without taking any credit for it. The door had barely settled back into place when the room felt different again, not louder, not busier, but more aware of what had just left it. The work continued, voices low, focused, but there was a subtle absence now, something that had been holding the center of the moment without anyone realizing it until it was gone. Daniel stood still for a second longer than necessary, his eyes resting on the glass where Maya had exited, her reflection already gone, leaving only the faint outline of the city behind it. Then he turned back, not slowly, not dramatically, just with intention. Update the counter terms, he said, his voice steady, grounded. Shift the liability back to shared risk. Equal exposure. No ambiguity. The legal team nodded, fingers moving immediately. But there was a new layer beneath their efficiency now, a kind of quiet respect for the process they had almost rushed through. One of the analysts glanced up briefly. Do we address the imbalance directly in the response? Daniel paused, considering, his gaze moving from the screen to the contract, then back again. No, he said after a moment. We let the structure speak. They will know we saw it. A small nod passed between the team members, an understanding without further explanation. The room continued to move, but the pace was different, not driven by urgency anymore, but by precision. Daniel picked up the contract once more, flipping through the pages again, but this time not searching for flaws. He was retracing the path, the exact sequence of decisions that had brought them to that moment, where they had trusted too quickly, where they had stopped questioning, and more importantly, where someone else had not. He closed the document slowly, and set it down. The sound was soft, controlled, final in a way that carried meaning beyond the paper itself. Across the table, the junior associate spoke again, more confident now. "We should run a full audit on Vaughn's previous deals," he said. "If this is their approach, this may not be the first time." Daniel nodded once. "Do it," he replied. No hesitation. No delay. The instruction moved through the room immediately, another layer of verification added to the process. But even as the work expanded, Daniel's focus narrowed again, not to the contract, not to the deal, but to something else entirely. A moment, a voice, a decision that had not been part of the system, but had changed it anyway. He stepped away from the table, walking toward the window again, his reflection faint against the glass. The city below moved as it always did, unaware, constant, unaffected. He watched it for a brief moment, then shifted his gaze slightly to the side, where the corridor outside the conference room stretched in quiet lines. Somewhere down that hall, Maya had already moved on to the next task, the next room, the next surface that needed attention. No pause, no recognition, just continuation. Daniel's hand rested lightly against the glass again, the cool surface grounding the thought that had begun to take shape more clearly now. He turned back toward the room, his expression composed, but something beneath it had changed. Not uncertainty, not hesitation, something more deliberate. He walked back to the table, but instead of stopping at his usual place, he moved past it, heading toward the door. A few heads lifted, noticing the shift, but no one spoke. He reached for the handle, pausing for just a second, then opened it quietly. The hallway outside was still, the soft hum of the building barely noticeable. He stepped out, closing the door behind him with the same controlled motion. The meeting continued without him, the team now fully aligned, fully engaged, but for Daniel, the focus had moved beyond the contract. It had moved toward the person who had seen what no one else had. And as he walked down the corridor, his steps measured, his gaze steady. One thought remained clear, steady, impossible to ignore. The deal could wait. The numbers could be fixed. But understanding why she spoke up, and what that said about everything he had overlooked, that was something he was no longer willing to leave unanswered. The hallway stretched out in quiet lines, the kind of silence that only existed in places where decisions were made behind closed doors. Daniel walked with steady steps, not rushed, but focused, his eyes scanning ahead, past office doors, past glass partitions, searching for something that had already moved on. The soft hum of overhead lights followed him, each step echoing slightly against the polished floor, a rhythm that felt slower than the pace inside the boardroom, but somehow more real. He passed a few employees along the way, some glancing up briefly, offering polite nods, but he barely registered them. His attention was elsewhere. Then, near the end of the corridor, he saw her. Maya stood beside another service cart, just outside a smaller conference room, wiping down the handle of the door with the same careful precision she had shown earlier. No rush, no hesitation, just quiet focus. Daniel slowed slightly before stopping a few feet away. For a moment, he did not speak. He watched the way she finished the motion, folding the cloth neatly, placing it back on the cart, as if completing a routine that did not depend on who was watching. "You moved on quickly," he said finally, his voice calm, carrying none of the edge it once had. Maya turned, meeting his gaze without surprise. "There is always another room," she replied. Simple, direct, as if that explained everything. Daniel nodded slightly, absorbing the meaning behind it. Work did not pause for moments. It continued. He glanced briefly at the door she had just cleaned, then back at her. "Back there," he said, "you did more than your job." Maya held his gaze for a second, then looked down briefly, adjusting the position of the cart by an inch, aligning it with the wall. "I saw something that did not look right," she said. "That is all." Daniel exhaled softly, the understatement not lost on him. "That is not all," he said, more to himself than to her. A brief silence settled between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It carried weight, reflection, something still forming. He shifted his stance slightly, no longer the CEO addressing an employee, but a man trying to understand a decision that had changed everything. "Most people would have stayed quiet," he said, "especially in that room." Maya's expression remained calm, unchanged. "Most people are not responsible for what they ignore," she said. The words landed with quiet precision. Not sharp, Not defensive, just true. Daniel felt that. He nodded slowly, his eyes dropping for a moment before lifting again. And you felt responsible, he said. It was not a question. Maya did not answer immediately. She looked past him briefly, down the corridor, then back again. If I know something can cause harm, she said, choosing each word carefully, and I say nothing, then I am part of the problem. The hallway seemed to hold that sentence, letting it settle into the space between them. Daniel's posture shifted slightly, the weight of it reaching deeper than the numbers, deeper than the contract, deeper than the deal itself. He looked at her differently now, not as someone who had interrupted a meeting, not as someone outside the system, but as someone who had acted when others had not. You studied finance, he said, recalling her earlier words. Maya nodded once. A few years, she replied. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. And now you are here, he said. It was not judgment. It was observation. Maya's expression did not change. Life does not always follow the plan, she said. Another simple truth. Another layer. Daniel let out a slow breath, the pieces aligning in a way he had not expected. The system he trusted. The structure he believed in. The roles he assigned without question. All of it had been incomplete. He straightened slightly, his voice steady again, but carrying something new beneath it. I need to ask you something, he said. Maya waited, her posture quiet, open, unchanged. Daniel met her eyes, not as authority, but with intention. If you had stayed silent, he said, what would have happened? The question hung there, not just about the contract, but about everything that led to that moment. Maya looked at him for a long second, then answered without hesitation. You would have signed it, she said. No drama, no emphasis, just fact. Daniel held her gaze, the truth of it settling fully now. He nodded once, slow, deliberate. And in that quiet hallway, far from the boardroom, far from the deal, something shifted again. Not in the company, not in the contract, but in the way he understood the value of a voice he had almost dismissed. Daniel did not look away after her answer. The hallway remained still, the quiet hum of the building settling around them like a space that had no need to rush. You would have signed it. The words did not echo, but they stayed. Not as an accusation, not even as a warning, just a fact that could not be undone, only understood. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment to the polished floor before lifting again. For someone who spent his life making decisions measured in millions of dollars, it was not the size of the risk that stayed with him. It was how close he had come to missing it entirely. And you still spoke, he said, his voice lower now, less controlled, more honest. Maya adjusted the edge of the cloth in her hands, smoothing it once before placing it back on the cart. Yes, sir. No pride. No hesitation. Just the same steady tone she had used from the beginning. Daniel exhaled, a longer breath this time, as if letting go of something he had not realized he was holding. He glanced briefly down the corridor, then back at her, his posture shifting again, less formal, less distant. Most people would have calculated the risk, he said. What it might cost them to speak up. Their job, their position, the reaction. Maya listened, her expression unchanged, but attentive. And you did not, he added. She shook her head slightly. I did, she said. Daniel's brow tightened a fraction. Then why speak, he asked. It was not a challenge. It was a question he needed answered clearly. Maya met his eyes, her voice quiet but certain. Because the cost of staying silent was higher. The sentence settled into the space between them, deeper than the one before. Daniel felt it immediately, not as logic, but as something more fundamental. A different way of measuring consequence. He nodded once, slowly, the meaning unfolding in a way that did not require further explanation. Behind them, a door opened somewhere down the hall, then closed again, footsteps passing briefly before fading. The building continued as it always did, but this moment remained separate from it, held in place by something neither of them was trying to control. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, then straightened, the instinct to return to structure pulling at him, but not overriding what he had just heard. You said you studied finance, he said again, not repeating the question, but building on it. You see patterns, risk, structure. Maya gave a small nod. I was taught to look for what does not belong, she said. Sometimes it is the smallest detail. Daniel allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not from amusement, but from recognition. That detail saved us, he said. Maya did not respond to that directly. She simply reached for the handle of the cart, adjusting its position again by a few inches, aligning it with the wall as she had done before. The movement was small, but precise. Daniel watched it, understanding more clearly now. It was not about recognition for her. It was about correction, about putting something back into alignment when it was not right. He nodded once, then spoke again, this time more deliberate. "I am going to ask you something else," he said. Maya paused, her hand still resting lightly on the cart, waiting. Daniel met her eyes, the distance between them no longer defined by roles, but by understanding still in progress. "If you had not been there," he said, "if you had not seen it, what would we have missed next?" Maya held his gaze for a moment, considering, not searching for an answer, but choosing how to give it. Then she spoke, her voice steady. "Unchanged. Whatever came after that," she said. "Because once you trust something that is not right, you stop questioning the rest." The words landed with a quiet finality, connecting everything that had happened to everything that could have followed. Daniel felt that shift again, deeper this time, not just about the contract, but about the way he had been operating without realizing it. He nodded slowly, the realization settling fully now. This was not just about a single decision. It was about how decisions were made. And as he stood there in the hallway, looking at the person who had seen what he had not, one truth became clear in a way it had never been before. The strongest systems were not the ones that moved the fastest. They were the ones that still listened when something small did not feel right. Daniel did not respond immediately. The hallway held the silence between them, not heavy, not tense, but deliberate, like something important had just been placed carefully into view. Once you trust something that is not right, you stop questioning the rest. He repeated the words in his mind, not as a sentence, but as a realization unfolding layer by layer. For years, he had built systems designed to move fast, to eliminate hesitation, to reward confidence. It had worked. It had made him successful. But standing there now, he could see the gap in it, the part that assumed the structure itself was always sound. Maya reached for the card again, her hands steady, adjusting the position of a small bottle that had shifted slightly out of place. The motion was subtle, almost invisible, but precise. Daniel noticed it, the same way he had begun noticing everything she did. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was consistent, intentional. "You do that with everything, do not you?" he said quietly. Maya glanced up, her expression calm. "Do what?" she asked. Daniel gestured lightly toward the cart, the cloth, the small alignment she had just corrected. "You fix what is out of place," he said. It was not a question. Maya looked at the cart for a brief second, then back at him. "If it is small, it is easier to fix," she said. "If you ignore it, it becomes something bigger later." The simplicity of it settled deeper than any analysis in the boardroom had. Daniel nodded. Slowly, the connection forming without effort now. The contract, the clause, the timeline. None of it had been obvious at first glance. But it had all been there, waiting to be noticed before it became something much harder to undo. He shifted his stance slightly, his posture no longer carrying the same distance it had earlier. "Back in that room," he said, everyone trusted the process. The review, the layers. Maya listened without interrupting. "You trusted what you saw," he added. She gave a small nod. "The process can miss things," she said. "People do too." Another pause followed, but this one carried clarity instead of uncertainty. Daniel looked down the corridor again, then back at her, his expression thoughtful, measured. "You are not working in the field you studied," he said. It was not a question. Maya's gaze held steady. "No, sir." "Why not?" he asked. There was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity now, genuine and unguarded. Maya took a small breath, not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement of the question. "My mother got sick," she said. "I needed to be home. After that, it was difficult to return." The words were simple, but they carried enough weight to explain what did not need to be expanded. Daniel nodded once, the answer fitting into place without further detail. Life had shifted her path, not her ability, not her way of thinking, just her direction. He looked at her for a moment longer, then spoke again, more deliberate this time. "You saw something a room full of trained professionals missed," he said. "That is not a small thing." Maya did not react the way most people would have. She did not straighten. She did not respond with surprise or pride. She simply held his gaze and answered in the same steady tone. "They were looking at the whole deal," she said. I was looking at one part. Daniel let out a quiet breath, the distinction settling in clearly. Focus. Not distraction. Not limitation. Precision. He nodded again, slower this time. And that one part changed everything, he said. Maya did not answer. She did not need to. The truth of it was already present in the space between them. Daniel shifted slightly, then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a simple business card. He looked at it for a second, then back at her. The gesture was not rushed, not performative, just considered. He extended it toward her, holding it steady. If you ever decide to go back, he said, his voice calm, to what you studied, I would like to know. Maya looked at the card, then at him, her expression unchanged but attentive. She did not take it immediately. Instead, she asked why. The question was simple, but direct. Daniel did not hesitate. Because I do not want to build something important again and miss the person who sees what matters, he said. The words settled without force, but with clarity. Maya held his gaze for a moment longer, then reached out and took the card, her fingers steady. She glanced at it briefly, then slipped it into the pocket of her uniform. No promise, no assumption, just acceptance. Daniel nodded once, a small gesture, but final. Then he stepped back, giving her space again, but this time the distance felt different. Not separation, not hierarchy, just respect. And as he turned to walk back down the corridor, toward the room where decisions were still being made, one thought remained clear, grounded in a way it had not been before. Sometimes the most important change does not come from adding something new. It comes from finally seeing what was already there. The door to the conference room opened quietly as Daniel stepped back inside, and for a moment, no one looked up. The team was still working, heads down, screens filled with revisions, notes layered over what had once been considered final. The rhythm had changed, but it had not slowed. It had sharpened. Daniel paused just inside the doorway, his hand resting briefly on the handle before letting it fall to his side. The room felt different now, not because of what had been found, but because of how it had been found. He walked back to the table, his steps measured, his presence no longer announcing itself with authority, but with intention. One of the analysts glanced up, then straightened slightly. We have restructured the liability distribution, he said, turning his screen slightly. Balanced exposure, capped penalties, and adjusted exit points. Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the changes, not quickly, not assuming, but carefully. Line by line, clause by clause, the way it should have been done the first time. And the timeline? He asked. Aligned, another voice responded. No. Early exit without shared consequence. Daniel held the gaze for a second, then gave a small nod. Good. The word was simple, but it carried weight now. Not approval given lightly, but earned through scrutiny. He moved around the table, stopping at his chair, but he did not sit immediately. Instead, he rested his hands lightly against the back of it, looking at the document one more time, then at the people around him. The same room, the same team, but not the same moment. We send this version, he said, his voice steady, clear. And we make it clear we are not moving forward without full transparency. Heads nodded. No hesitation. No overconfidence. Just understanding. The decision was no longer about speed. It was about clarity. Daniel finally sat, the leather chair shifting softly beneath him, but the posture was different now. Less rigid. More grounded. He picked up the pen again, turning it once between his fingers before setting it down beside the contract. He did not need to sign anything yet. Not until everything matched. Across the table, the junior associate watched him for a brief second, then returned to his notes, a faint shift in confidence visible in the way he moved. The room had learned something. Not from failure, but from how close it had come. Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting for just a moment toward the glass wall, where the reflection of the city stretched out beyond the room. The light had softened now, the sharp edges of the skyline blending into something calmer, more even. He saw his own reflection faintly in the glass, then the room behind him, layered together in a way that made it hard to separate one from the other. Structure and perspective, surface and depth. He understood the difference now. He looked back at the table, at the contract that had nearly gone unnoticed, at the corrections that now brought it back into balance. Then his gaze shifted briefly, almost unconsciously, toward the door. Closed. Quiet. Just like before. But not the same. Not to him. He reached for the contract one last time, not to sign, not to finalize, but to close it. The sound was soft, controlled, final in a way that did not need emphasis. The room continued working, refining, adjusting, but the turning point had already passed, and it had not come from strategy, or authority, or experience. It had come from someone who had no reason to be heard, but chose to speak anyway. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the closed document, his expression calm, but changed in a way that did not show on the surface. Not entirely. And as the last of the daylight faded across the glass, leaving behind a quieter reflection of the room, one thought settled into place with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. He had walked into that meeting ready to lead. But it was Maya, standing at the edge of the room, who had shown him what it meant to see.